In South Africa, we are increasingly made aware that our statistics of femicide and gender-based violence are alarming. And while we are in the midst of Women's Month, we would like to use the opportunity to gain a clear understanding of what these figures look like and what the contributing factors are exactly. And so this morning we're asking the question, what works to prevent violence against women in South Africa? And we're joined by Executive Scientist in the Research Strategy in the Office of the President at the South African Medical Research Council, Professor Rachel Jewkes, to help us discuss this topic, and would like to hear your thoughts. So please do go onto our Facebook page, Expresso Morning Show SABC3, and drop a comment there. Dr. Jewkes, good morning. Thank you very much for making the time.
Good morning to be so.
Professor, you are an A-rated researcher and do very important work as the Consortium Director for the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls global program. Please explain to us what the organization does exactly and your role within the organization.
Yes, well, the What Works program is embedded within the South African Medical Research Council, and we've been working in 13 countries in Africa and Asia, and we've been assessing the magnitude of violence against women and girls and trying to understand drivers of violence in very different cultural contexts. And then we've been developing and testing different interventions to try and build an understanding of what works to prevent violence against women and girls in these different settings. And 2 of our studies have been conducted in South Africa, but the others have been in places like Ghana or Zambia or Tajikistan or Afghanistan, very, very different parts of the world. And that sort of really helped us to understand to what degree what we're looking at is culturally specific, to what degree what we're looking at cuts across different geographical regions.
Dr. Jewkes, gender-based violence is an absolute pandemic in our country. It's a serious problem. But what are the hard figures looking like of gender-based violence in the country, and how are these stats put together?
Well, it's a huge problem. We're not really sure exactly what the national prevalence is in the country. The latest data we have from the 2016 Health Survey shows that about 1 in 10 women are beaten by a partner every year. But I think most of us think that's a bit low. And research we've done as part of What Works in informal settlements shown that 2/3 of women are experiencing partner violence, physical or sexual violence, every year. And we also know that up to 1/4 of men disclose in our research having raped a woman in their lifetime, and about 1 in 20 every year. And then there's the terrible problem of suicide. And we are talking about 3 women being killed by an intimate partner every day in South Africa.
Wow. Those statistics are disheartening, they are heavy, they are unbelievable, they are way too high, Professor. We hear so often that South Africa's stats of femicide and gender-based violence are amongst the highest and worst in the entire world. How do we compare to the rest of the world, and what exactly do you think contributes to our higher incidences of violence?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if we look at the figure I gave you from informal settlements, that is one highest prevalences of violence that's been recorded ever anywhere.
Wow.
National figure is not so high, and there are many other countries like Tanzania and Uganda and India and Papua New Guinea that have very, very high rates of violence. So we're not on our own in terms of partner violence. Femicide got about the highest rate that's been recorded anywhere, but most countries don't even know how many women are killed by intimate partners every day. And so the comparisons are not very strong. When we look at rape, we do know that the rate of rape in South Africa is amongst the highest in the world. There are a few countries where we have interviewed men, where we actually get the disclosure that they have raped at the level that we are being told has happened in South Africa. And that's completely supported by the reports of rape that come in from women.
Well, the thing is, Dr. Jewkes, just listening to these stats and hearing that you've heard people say that these numbers don't sound like they're high, is that even just one woman having to go through this is unnecessary. It should not be happening. It's way too high. We've got a comment here on Facebook, because we did ask everybody else out there to weigh in on the conversation. Tembi Mujela says it's a matter of time. Enough is enough. It starts with us, leaders, role models, community, police. When you see anyone being abused, you don't have to keep quiet or ignore it. By helping each other to put the monsters behind bars, and government should give these monsters a painful sentence. And I think it boils down to the justice system and people working together to make sure that those who are perpetrators are brought to account.
Yes.
Dr. Jewkes, of course, this conversation will continue. Thank you so much for staying with us this morning.
Yeah. Now, what works to prevent violence against women in South Africa? We're diving deeper into this discussion with Executive Scientist and Research Strategy at the South African Medical Research Council, Professor Rachel Jewkes. So if you do have any questions or comments, please make sure to comment on our Facebook page, Expresso Show SABC3, and we will continue this conversation shortly.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back to it. It is your feel-good breakfast show, Expresso. We are live on SABC3. It's a beautiful Monday morning, and we thank you for being a part of this show this morning. And of course, we're discussing relationships this morning, and really in the midst of Women's Month, joined by Executive Scientist in Research Strategy at the South African Medical Research Council, Professor Rachel Jewkes, who we spoke to a bit earlier on this morning, to help us discuss the stats of femicide and gender-based violence in our country. It's a conversation we shouldn't be having. We don't want to be having this. There's nothing joyful about it, but of course very, very necessary and very important to have as we speak about GBV in the country. Thank you very much, Dr. Jewkes, for staying with us, or rather Professor Jewkes.
Good. Glad to be back again. Thank you.
It's not lost on women that every August, our Women's Month is spent focusing on, you know, the issue of femicide and gender-based violence. This is emotionally exhausting work, I have to admit. But why is it important, you know, to use this month as an opportunity to gain a better understanding on these issues?
Well, I think it's critical that we understand what we're doing in order to be able to tackle it effectively. It's not enough to express outrage, but our outrage is what has brought the government to focus on gender-based violence, to put together the process has resulted in the National Strategic Plan and has resulted in setting up a council on gender-based violence and femicide. And we need these structures to be backed up by funding and to be backed up by a really firm commitment, and also held to account by civil society in order to ensure that we actually address this terrible scourge facing the country.
We've looked at the problem and we've discussed it, and maybe not, you know, you can never discuss it enough because it's such a complex and such a big problem. But now begs the question, which is the focus of your work, Professor Jewkes. What works to prevent violence against women and girls in South Africa? What works?
Well, I think what's really important is for us to understand that there is a global body of evidence now that shows us. We've actually had nearly 100 studies conducted testing different interventions to find out if they really can reduce violence. And what we've seen is that there are a set of nearly 10 different groups of interventions that works. Now, one of the key drivers of violence is poverty. And so it's interesting that interventions that have picked that up actually do reduce violence. And we've seen that cash transfers themselves can reduce the violence women experience. And we've also seen that a range of different financial income-generating interventions that combine an element of the interventions trying to change the way in which women and men think about themselves in terms of their gender and gender relations actually impact on experience and perpetration of violence. We've seen that in South Africa with the microfinance interventions combining a gender transformative component, and we've seen it in other settings with income generating activities. We've also seen it with livelihood strengthening interventions that have been used in informal settlements in South Africa, that have really made an impact on both livelihoods as well as the experience of violence in this setting where violence is really very highly prevalent. We've also seen that interventions spun out across communities that work with communities over a long period of time, challenging gender norms and supporting survivors within the communities can really have an impact across very large sectors of communities. These are not quick fixes. They take years to be able to put in place to sort of take up to scale. They require a great deal of activism within the communities, which is coordinated, supported with lay community workers being trained in what to do and how to do it. But that can really change the way in which gender norms are performed across communities and the use of violence. And so that's really critical. We've seen some good success from some parenting programs, particularly around the birth of a child, combining gender transformative elements with elements around better parenting and violence reduction. And these programs need to involve men. So they don't work if we just leave the parenting to women. We have to remember the critical role of fathers in parenting and the critical role of men in perpetrating violence against women. And so men need to be a key part of interventions to change and stop violence against women. It need not to be, we shouldn't be targeting men on their own. We need to target them with women. And we've also seen the value of mental health interventions, interventions that address alcohol abuse can be very effective. And there's emerging work around the role of other community institutions, particularly including schools, where interventions can really change violence perpetrated by adolescents in schools, but we've seen the success with interventions that are not delivered by teachers, interventions that are more participatory and gender transformative, delivered in the school space, but outside school time. And we've seen success of interventions delivered by churches. And I think that that's another thing. South Africa has a very high prevalence of religiosity within the community. And I think it's really important that we harness the potential benefit of church structures, much as we understand that the misuse of teachings from scriptures can also increase the oppression of women and violence against women. And the South African Council of Churches has just announced a new initiative to address patriarchy. And I think that that's absolutely key and could make a real difference within our communities. So these interventions can be really effective. It's also important that we remember other very high-risk groups. Sex workers are one of the highest risk groups within our communities. And there are interventions to reduce the violence that they experience from the police, from men within the community. Yeah. And collectivization of sex workers can really be effective in reducing the extremely high levels of violence that they experience.
There's so many ways, and I love the work that has gone into distilling all of these areas, Professor Jewkes. But of course, this conversation cannot just be had in a matter of minutes. There's so much to get into. But thank you very much for your time and for joining us. We really have such a deep appreciation for the work that you do, and hopefully this translates in the communities and people are able to find those solutions and really act on that. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Let's close it off on a feel-good note. I think Jared Ricketts is on standby to give us the last performance for the morning.
Yes.